Hello and welcome to Perspectiva. I'm Tom Philpot. Now, the European Union is calling for stronger border security following the recent migrant crossings into the Spanish city of Ceuta. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has urged a united European response, describing the incident as a reminder that protecting the EU's external borders is a shared responsibility. The appeal comes after tens of thousands of migrants crossed into Ceuta from Morocco, and one of the largest sudden migration movements seen at the border. The Spanish authorities say that approximately 69,500 migrants have now returned to Morocco, exceeding earlier estimates. Officials also report that 72 people died on the Spanish side of the border, while 11 more were recorded on the Moroccan side. In a letter to the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, Ursula von der Leyen praised Spain's swift handling of the situation. However, she stressed that the European Union must strengthen security at vulnerable border points and improve coordination among member states. Now, the European Commission President has also called for enhanced cooperation with neighbouring countries to prevent irregular migration, stronger external border management, improved early warning systems and tougher action against migrant smuggling networks and more effective return procedures for those without legal permission to remain. Now, Spain has expressed concerns over divisions within the European Union following the incident. Italy temporarily suspended its Schengen arrangements with Spain, a move supported by Finland and Denmark. Meanwhile, the Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš called for Spain's temporary suspension from the Schengen system. Well, the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez criticised his reactions, saying some governments had responded with prejudice, misinformation or political interests instead of solidarity. He also reminded European leaders that Ceuta is not part of the Schengen area. Now, despite the disagreements, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen emphasised that protecting the Union's external borders requires collective action and cooperation among member states. Spanish officials say that conditions in Ceuta have largely returned to normal. The Interior Minister Fernando Grande Marlaska has also said authorities are working on installing an inflatable water barrier to help prevent future illegal crossings by sea. The EU is expected to use the lessons learned from the Ceuta crisis to strengthen its migration and border management policies, with a renewed focus on security, cooperation and solidarity across Europe. To discuss this issue, we're joined by Henry Rogers, a foreign policy and European affairs expert. Henry, hello and welcome to Perspectiva. So the recent migrant crossings into Ceuta have once again exposed vulnerabilities at the EU's external borders. In your view, what were the main factors that led to the sudden influx of migrants, and what lessons should the EU learn from this crisis?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. When we look at the driving factors behind this crisis, I think we have two sides of the same coin. On one side, we have Spanish policy changes that were perceived by individuals in Morocco and Africa. And then we have employment issues and security issues in Africa that are driving individuals to cross the border. On the Spanish policy side, we have the recent Supreme Court ruling that affected and changed the legal ability of the Spanish to immediately return migrants if they cross by water or ocean, because under Spanish law, it's not technically crossing the border, providing a minor loophole. And then we have the policy that has been enacted that enables individuals who have been in Spain, immigrants who have been in Spain before 2026, providing them a legal pathway for a one-year work visa, which of course was overwhelmed by the amount of applicants and has faced criticism. And then we have both of those then being, of course, perceived by individuals in Morocco who are thinking about crossing, other immigrants throughout Africa who are thinking about crossing. And we live in this era of social media and the quick dissemination of information and the game of telephone that often happens. We need to understand that the immigrants who crossed the border were two groups of people. We have, first of all, Moroccans who are driven by high unemployment rates in Morocco, low quality of life because of their economic situation, who perceive Spain as a better country to elevate their economic situation for themselves and their family. And then we have individuals from sub-Saharan Africa who are fleeing climate change issues, but more importantly, security issues in Sudan, security issues across the Sahel because of terrorist organizations and the violence that occurs from all those conflicts. It's important to break up these two groups because when we look at the Moroccans, they for the most part, largely returned voluntarily to Morocco because of the harsh conditions of living on the beach in Ceuta, lack of shelter, lack of food, lack of privacy, and eventually returned to Morocco. We need to then understand the other group, which is these sub-Saharan individuals, have not returned, and that is because they're fleeing a more escalatory, more heightened, more severe issues, which are only going to continue in the long run to fuel immigration crises that Europe is going to continue to face. And when we talk about the long run, I want to address those solutions you brought up. Europe has faced immigration issues before, whether that's the 2015, 2016 crisis or other surges across the Spanish enclaves in Africa, driven by conflict, driven by climate change, driven by other issues, especially in the Middle East. But Europe tends to treat these as one-off occurrences. And when we look at this event, we're seeing, oh, this is an issue, this needs to be resolved. Okay, we're going to move forward. We're not going to look at this or deal with this on the systemic level. And so I think Europe needs to learn that because of the escalating climate change, because of escalating conflicts, because you have major powers withdrawing from the rules-based order, we're going to see continuing instability in Africa, instability in the Middle East that's going to contribute to migration influxes to Europe. And Europe needs to start treating these as a systemic issue.
Well, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has called for stronger external border protection and greater cooperation among the EU member states. How effective do you think these proposed measures will be in preventing similar migration crises in the future?
Every time we have a migration crisis, whether that's the United States, whether that's Europe, there's always calls for stronger border protection. And of course, border protection and heightened border protection is a part of this larger puzzle, but it's more of a short-term solution. It's more of a band-aid on this systemic issue that Europe's going to continue to face. If we look in the short term, we've seen Spain actually erect floating barriers around Ceuta to prevent future marine crossings by immigrants. The issue with that is immigrants are going to continue to change the systems of which they enter Europe because they're being driven by these external threats, and then therefore will turn around and use human ingenuity to enter. So it's a game of cat and mouse, and it's a short-term band-aid. If you look at the early 2020s, and before that, you had individuals crossing into Ceuta and the other Spanish enclave in North Africa through climbing fences and sprinting in large groups. Now you have a shift to maritime crossings. These are going to continue to change, and by playing catch up with border protection is important. Let me say that caveat, but it's not the long-term solution. And I very much do think heightened EU collaboration is a long-term solution that is really vital. And that's going to be really important as we have these EU free passage for EU citizens, and that's a larger part. And when you incorporate immigration, refugees into that, you have a clash between these individual nationalistic governments dealing with that, and then the larger organization. And when we've seen the EU come together and we've seen unification efforts, that's been really important. And I believe that is what the EU is going to need to really deal with this crisis.
Well, the Ceuta incident has created disagreements among European countries, with some member states criticising Spain's handling of the situation. Just what does this reveal about the current state of unity and solidarity within the EU on migration issues?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up because I think this Ceuta crossing is very much a inflection point for what we're going to see in the next decade in Europe and likely the decade after that. And what you've got, of course, the Italian government under Meloni applying pressure to Spain, sending negative signals about the treatment of this crisis with that temporary pause on the Schengen agreement between the two countries. You've got this rising nationalism, these rising more conservative, far-right governments in Europe that are growing, whether that's the far right in France or other governments that we're facing. And that's going to continue to be a fracture point for the EU. Of course, these governments are less favorable to the EU, but a large part of what these governments do, or what these rising governments thrive on, is this anti-immigrant, pro-quality of life, pro-safety, strength platform. And by pushing back against immigration, these governments benefit by rallying their supporters. And when we see these governments and these nationalist governments rising across Europe, we're going to continue to see these fraction points. But like I said before, we're going to continue to see surges of immigration. And this is going to be two major forces pushing against each other and really acting as a stress test on the European Union and on European unity, when it's important more than ever for these European countries to come together and actually deal with immigration. Because for considerable reasons that I can go into farther, you need European Union you need European Union unity to collaborate with border countries on intelligence and on counter immigration policy. You need European funding to deal with shelter and support for immigrants, as well as the capacity for administration of applications of immigrants. These are really important to deal with the systemic issues of immigration. But having a divided European Union, because these nationalist governments are relying on anti-immigration rhetoric to gain strength and then pushing back against each other, pushing back against the European Union, it's going to be very fractious, and it's very negative for what we're going to see for the European Union for the next decade, very destabilizing.
Well, Spain has argued that migration should be treated as a shared European responsibility rather than the burden of one country alone. How important is collective responsibility in managing migration, and what practical steps should the EU member states take to support frontline countries?
Yeah, like I was saying before, Europe coming together and working on this issue is vital, especially when we look at Spain. Spain, with its two enclaves in North Africa, is really Europe's, is not just Spain's border with Morocco, Spain's border with Africa, it's Europe's border with Africa because of the Schengen system, because of the interconnected nature of the European Union. And that needs to be understood, and Europe needs to step in and work together with Spain if it wants to have effective policy against the systemic issue of immigration. Now, concrete steps, like I was just mentioning before, we need to see Europe work together and fund and support relief for minors and immigrant minors that are dealing with this crisis. Right now, we have hundreds, I think over 800 minors because of this surge of crossings just recently. However, there's only a few dozen shelter locations, shelter beds for these individuals to take. The system is in Spain is really suffering, and that's because you don't have that unified European-wide system to support, fund, and alleviate burden from one country. But it's also really important to understand that Europe is the president of the European Commission has been calling for increased cooperation with border countries as well as European unity. And the reason that those two work really importantly hand in hand is because for Spain to really deal with this, it needs to have continued work, communication, collaboration with the Moroccan government. As we've seen these 70,000, this majority of these Moroccan individuals return to Morocco. That's because of that possible collaboration and, of course, proximity. But Morocco in the past, and will again, because it's a country and states act in their best interests, will attempt to leverage its pressure against Spain because of the immigration crisis to gain support for its initiatives in the Western Sahara. And Europe, by being unified behind this, Europe is able to push back against this leverage that Morocco would be applying to Madrid, applying to Spain, and apply a more unified front, allowing cooperation and collaboration with Morocco to be more aligned with the goals of the European Union when it comes to Western Sahara, when it comes to geopolitics in North Africa, instead of allowing a country like Morocco to leverage its immigration collaboration with Spain for gains, diplomatic or otherwise, in these fields. That's why it's very, and of course, as I mentioned before, it's really important that we see the administration of these applications for border countries such as Spain be bolstered and boosted and supported with joint European unity, funding, support, and manpower, of course.
Well, alongside strengthening borders, the EU has also proposed dismantling migrant smuggling networks and improving return procedures for irregular migrants. Just how could authorities balance stricter enforcement with the need to uphold humanitarian principles and international human rights obligations?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because, of course, there's been a lot of discussion coming out of Madrid, coming out of Spain about the traffickers, about them pressuring these migrants through coercion, through propaganda, to get them to cross over. And we have to understand that a large part of this is shifting the burden to these traffickers. Of course, traffickers are a part of the issue, and it's an abhorrent industry that takes advantage of individuals who are suffering. However, we also have to understand that it's a multi-blame game, and by blaming just the traffickers, we're undercutting the ability to enact quality policy to deal with the systemic immigration crisis that we're facing. Now, when it comes to the ability to combat these traffickers, use more security and counter immigration measures while also balancing humanitarian issues, it's of course the crux of the issue. It's being dealt with a lot. In other areas that are dealing with immigration to varying degrees, whether that's in the US, where we've seen a larger swing away from humanitarian, or other areas. But we have to understand, when it comes to dismantling these trafficking networks, when it comes to using harsher policy against immigration pathways, like I said before, human beings are highly innovative, and continued pressure externally against these individuals, driving them north, driving them to Europe, is not going to prevent them because there's perhaps a higher rate of injury, or it's a lot more difficult to cross, or the trafficking pathways are changing. That isn't going to change. And where there's money, you're always going to have illicit industries because of trafficking. So yes, it is important to curb them, and it is important to use policies to curb them. This is not the ultimate path forward, and should not be treated as the solution, more as a band-aid and a way to curb high numbers. But to really deal with this, we have to use those previous discussions I talked about, that European unity, that support for administration applications. And then, of course, you have the long-term solution of being more involved in the stability of Africa, the stability of the Middle East, these regions that are contributing to immigration to Europe. I'm not calling for widespread European intervention into these regions, but this is the value of aid. This is the value of diplomatic relationships and communicating and working with countries. Is by supporting them and bolstering them, you do lower immigration in the long term. So that needs to be an angle that's pursued.
Well, Henry, the humanitarian impact of the Ceuta crossings has been severe, with dozens of reported deaths on both sides. What additional measures should governments and international organisations take to ensure the border security efforts do not come at the expense of migrant safety and human dignity?
Look, I think we very much need to be able to anticipate these surges, and that starts with intelligence and collaboration with border states. We have reports that there was not a prediction by Spanish intelligence agencies, that there was not an ability to understand that this would be happening. And I believe that's a failure of the apparatus that's currently in place, and the ability to have effective migration control. These surges are where we're going to see surges of mortality, surges of injury, because we don't have the ability to treat or take care of, deploy the Red Cross or other important NGOs. And it needs to be able to be anticipated. So I think it really starts with heightening intelligence gathering capabilities for when we're going to expect these surges, and heightening the ability to predict these events that are going to contribute to degrading in the ability to take care of the individuals crossing, or apply humanitarian aid and humanitarian standards that human beings deserve. So I believe it starts with intelligence, and I believe it starts with cooperating with Morocco or other border states and their intelligence agencies.
And looking ahead, do you believe the Ceuta crisis will influence the EU's long-term migration and asylum policies? And what policy reforms do you expect to emerge from this incident? And how should they shape the future of migration management across Europe?
Well, look, I think when it comes to long-term, like I said, I do think this is an inflection point. I do think this is highly influential. It hinges on a number of things. Is the European Union going to treat this as a one-off crisis that needs to be solved with unity, dealt with, and then moved on from? Or is the European Union going to understand that this is a systemic issue, treat it as such, and therefore move forward with a stronger, more progressive, strengthened policy? And then moving past whether Europe chooses to learn the lesson from this or not, and see this as more of a systemic long-term issue, where we're going to see more inflection points, we're going to see more hotspots and surges like this. It depends on the domestic politics of the government. Are these more conservative far-right governments effective at wielding immigration and other concerns in gains in France and other countries that are facing coming elections and the escalation of more conservative far-right governments? Is Italy going to be able to capitalize this, applying more pressure to the European Union? And does that cause a fracturing and a more ineffective, individualistic immigration policy, which would be less effective and would cause different countries to suffer more and struggle more with the immigration crisis, contributing to destabilization and a more struggling Europe in the next 10, 20 years? Or do we see continued European Union unity? Do we see the pressures coming from the Russian war in Ukraine, the pressures coming from a rising Chinese economy against the European economy, continue to solidify and consolidate European Union, therefore allowing it to implement far more effective policy unified when it comes to immigration? When it comes to predicting the policy changes that we're going to see out of this, in the short term, we're going to see the traditional heightened protection on the borders. We're going to see heightened European rhetoric and discussion about protecting the borders, about security side of this issue, and a more decrease in the humanitarian conversation. I do believe that unity aspect, that ability to enact those changes when it comes to support for refugees who are minors, when it comes to supporting the administration on those border countries and heightened collaboration with non-EU border countries, that is more the midterm, and that's really going to hinge in the next 6 months to a year whether Europe chooses to treat this as that systemic issue. So I think that's how we have to look at these predictions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Well, next up, we look at how the breast cancer screening gap is leaving younger women more at risk.